Anyone have some folks that might be newer to meditation than others, any questions on just basic breathing meditation? Again, in Tibetan Buddhism, we often talk about kind of two different types of meditation. One of them is this sort of stabilizing meditation to try to bring the mind to some level of single-pointed focus. Obviously, it takes a long time to cultivate a very stable mind that we can stay present with whatever it is that we're meditating on for a very long time. But that's one important part of our practice. Because otherwise, if the mind is like a pinball machine and distracted all over, how can we even contemplate anything? The other type of meditation, though, is analytical meditation. We call it that, or some people, I think, give other names to it, but it's a fancy term for thinking. Essentially, what we do is think about whatever it is that we're wanting to meditate on. If we're wanting to meditate on compassion or meditate on some of the other teachings of the Buddha or anything else from any spiritual tradition, it's helpful to investigate things. And of course, this was the advice even from the Buddha himself. He said, don't believe things because he said them, believe them because you've seen them as truth for yourself. So analytical meditation is perhaps a more important part of our meditation practice because it's how we actually get our heads around whatever it is that we're trying to learn. There are different types of analytical meditation. Some of them are so that we can generate our mind into that, like compassion. You don't meditate on compassion to understand it, to see the truth of it. You meditate on compassion to be compassionate. So there are some that are a little more about developing qualities. Others are about developing understanding, coming to see things through our own investigation as logical, as making sense, as having some grounding in truth. Anyway, I just wanted to point that out in case some of you, again, are newer to Tibetan Buddhism and meditation. These can be applied, as I said, to any spiritual tradition. I think it's really helpful to have some form of a contemplative practice to be able to look at whatever it is that we believe that we are holding to and then come to see that as truth for ourselves. So, sorry, long-winded explanation, but let's go ahead and start with just then that stabilizing meditation, just bringing the awareness to the breath in whatever way you've chosen to work with the breath and trying not to let it wander. But when you notice that it has wandered, then just gently guide the mind back to the breath. So we'll do this for a few minutes and then I'll lead you in what's more or less an analytical meditation, meditating on developing a good motivation for today. So now let's set our motivation and let's start with that very basic premise that we've spoken of already this weekend, that every being, ourselves included, simply wants to be happy and doesn't want to suffer. And recall that there's no fault in that. That's just our nature. That is what we are seeking. Our actions throughout every day geared at achieving those results, finding happiness, not suffering. And we can start with a motivation that really wants ourselves, each of us, to find the happiness that we seek, to be free from all suffering. And these thoughts of love and compassion towards ourselves can become the seed from which compassion for all beings, love for all beings will grow. We have to want this for ourselves to generate that first level of motivation. Again, you're here to achieve a greater sense of peace, happiness, well-being, to not suffer quite as much, to be able to eventually be free from all suffering. But then when we recognize that other beings are just like us in that very fundamental way, we have to expand our motivation to include their welfare. Just as we want happiness, they too want happiness. The lowliest creature in this planet wants happiness in the same way that we do. It doesn't want to suffer in the way that we do. All beings, exactly like us, just like us. So let's generate a motivation that includes them and their welfare, thinking that we're here, again, to work on ourselves, but not just for ourselves alone, so that we can become instruments of love and compassion in the world, bringing joy, happiness to all beings. Whatever way we can do that, we generate a motivation to move in that direction, to increase our capacity to be of service and benefit to all beings. And just kind of rest in that thought and feel the joy that accompanies that thought. We get out of our little narrow, tight self-concern and think about all beings. It's an opening of the heart, an opening to joy. And just rest for a moment in that joyful motivation of being here for the welfare of all beings. Okay, again, I hope everyone had a good rest last night. We're going to dive back into that wonderful topic of gratitude and kind of conclude that and then move on to the seventh pillar, the pillar of compassion. We kind of meditated on already today. So let's go ahead and get back into the slides. Well, let me just open it up too. If there were any comments anyone needed to share, things that came to mind since we last met last night that you feel like you need to share? I just think it's good to give an opportunity for that before things get lost. Because as we get into more material and other things, sometimes then we lose that. Anything anyone felt they needed to share? Okay, good. All right. Thank you, Patrick, for being vigilant and having the microphone ready. Online, any folks, anything, anyone want to share anything? Okay, then let's move forward. And so in gratitude, we were talking about this uh, final topic, I think, before we get into kind of concluding thoughts on this, on gratitude and overcoming negative bias. And Douglas Abrams says scientists have long known that our brains have evolved with a negative bias. It was no doubt advantageous for our survival to focus on what was wrong or dangerous. I mentioned this last night, right? That kept us alive and kept us as a species that could adapt to things because we were aware of what might be a threat. Gratitude cuts across this default mode of the mind. It allows us to see what is good and right and not just what is bad and wrong. Of course, we still need a lot of training in that too. I know, part of our culture is seeing fault, finding fault, judging others. And this is something that kind of pervades the media, pervades our own thoughts and behaviors around others. We still need to work on cutting through that negative bias. But gratitude's very powerful at overcoming that. UC Davis professor Robert Emmons, he's actually written a couple of books on gratitude, really nice books. He's been studying gratitude for over a decade. In one study with his colleagues, Michael McCullough and Joanne Sang, they found grateful people do not seem to ignore or deny the negative aspects of life. They simply choose to appreciate what is positive as well. So they don't become kind of obsessed and lingering over what is negative. They have a deeper appreciation, though, for what is positive. So it's not to say that we get rid of any awareness of what is negative. We still need to address what's going on, the problems, the difficulties. As we said, we even have gratitude for some of the difficulties that we have in our lives, seeing them as opportunities to change and to grow. But that isn't our main focus. We don't go about our day just constantly looking for what is wrong, constantly judging people for their faults and not appreciating what we have and what others have. So it seems gratitude is motivating, not demotivating. Grateful people report more positive emotions, more vitality and optimism, and greater life satisfaction, as well as lower levels of stress and depression. This is one of the things certainly we've seen in regard to some of these. They've talked about like the physical effects of having these particular emotions. And I'm, again, not a researcher of all these things, so I can't speak to all of the ins and outs of it. But we do know that from scientific research that the mind and the body are symbiotic. They are having a relationship with each other. We are very much influenced, certainly, by what goes on in our body and our brain and what have you. But what we think has an influence on our physical well-being as well, or one way or the other, increasing it or decreasing it. His Holiness has pointed out in some studies he read that people who tend to think me, I, that's like their whole day, that they are more prone to heart attacks. This has been shown through scientific study. The narrower one is in one's view and one's own kind of selfish preoccupation, the more we put our own life at risk in a sense. Um, so again, there's a lot of studies out there. I really do find that's one of the most inspiring things is all of the scientific research that has gone into positive psychology. And there's going to be a few other folks that are mentioned as we go through today, including Paul Gilbert, who's written a number of books. He's developed what's called compassion focused therapy, where he's using compassion as a tool to help people. And there are so many, again, it's really rich here, Robert Emmons researching gratitude. Of course, this is 10 years. How many years ago? This was back in 2015, 2016. So he's been researching gratitude a long, long, long time, right? So again, this is, I think, reassuring that we do have a lot of people who are focusing on how positive emotions can be used in our culture to help general well-being, physical well-being even. So I do have one question before we do our concluding thoughts, and I think it's just something to entertain. You can answer this if you'd like, but is there something important in your life that you have somehow failed to fully appreciate? Where are we maybe deficient in our gratefulness, gratitude in regard to something that we should be more grateful for? Maybe we kind of take those things for granted is what I'm getting at, right? We use that phrase often. Anyone want to share anything on that? I don't want to, again, this is completely optional for sharing if anybody wanted to talk about something perhaps that they are seeing now in the moment or, through this investigation of gratitude that they haven't really fully appreciated. Anyone? No one wants to speak to it. I am asking people to maybe look at kind of the deficient side of you, but I think that's helpful sometimes, to be able to share that and to say, because then sometimes when you share it publicly, then you have to address it. Because anyway, Lindsay, good morning. There.
Good morning. Apologies that we're running late. I'm worried I might have missed the assignment here of what you were just saying. But if thinking about this, like one of the most profound things that you said, Don, of something that stuck with me was about gratitude, about a difficult situation, was the possibility that it's like releasing you for, sorry, I feel bad with you all behind me, for something down in the future that maybe I don't see yet. Some sort of obstacle or challenge. And even though it's really difficult, the other thing I've been thinking about is sort of this sense that each time you face similar challenges, you sort of get another chance to try to apply new learning and new growth in the situation as it comes around again. And I think the examples I'm talking about may seem more abstract than a concrete example, but like with our work challenges and some things that have been happening, I feel very fortunate. If I think about the years of taking classes with Don or coming to Land of Medicine or seeing many people here, it's really fortunate that we're here this weekend and getting this teaching. And for me, it's pretty timely with some things happening in the upcoming week with my professional situation. And so some of the features of what will be really challenging about it have been challenging before. But in something that is sort of more like a pillar, like a joy, I'm kind of having some sense of joy about the opportunity to manage them differently again, like in a new way, a fresh take again. And maybe I do have some wiser ideas that I would handle it differently than I have in the past. And yeah, I think you were talking about something painful in your life, Don, that you realize in retrospect might have gotten you on the path.
Absolutely.
And I think that some of these are like that for me, So I'm grateful for that. And it's sort of surprising. My past self would have been surprised to hear me get to gratitude about it, I think.
Yeah, great. Thanks for sharing, Lindsay. Yeah. And I hope the week coming up is you can be grateful for whatever happens. Anyone else want to share anything along this line? Mary, please. I think it is hard sometimes to look at, the things that we maybe haven't done as well and to try to rectify some of that, but these are all the tools for doing that. Yeah. All right, please.
On the same line, as you, it's Lindsay, right? I've had something happen in my life just recently that I've approached in a way that I'm not very proud of, with anger and fear. The anger was based on fear and all of that. And my behavior has been something I don't recognize in myself. My behavior hasn't been normal. And this opportunity of recognizing my anger and having this situation in my life, it's with my daughter, my adult daughter, who's pulling away. And I'm not letting her do it very easily. I'm grasping. I'm grasping, and I need to let her go. And I need to do it in a way that is with love and peace and compassion instead of holding on to that part of me that is still has anger within me
Mhm.
about it all. So this weekend is the beginning of me working through that. I've got a ways to go, but I see light at the end of the tunnel, so to
Mhm.
speak. And I see a path forward that is a path that I didn't see before.
Mm.
And it's positive. I can see that we're going to be better off after this
Mm.
incident in our life than we were before. So
Wow.
that's what I'm getting from this weekend.
Oh, wonderful. Thanks for sharing that, Mary. And I hope things go in the best possible direction for you and your daughter in regard to that. Yeah. And that's to keep in mind yet again, because once more, we can't change the other person. We can only change ourselves. And so to have that perspective, but also to be attentive to the needs of the other person is important. So great. Thank you. Anyone else online or here in the Gompa who would like to share anything around, and again, things you've seen that have come to the forefront of your attention that you think might deserve some gratitude or some different way of looking at them? Let's carry on then. Again, I do have a few concluding thoughts, and I want to go over the sort of homework advice as well, if you will, the practices, the things that you can take with you that you can use. That I think, again, there's one from Brother David that is really quite nice. So these are some of the thoughts from the book, at least, that I pulled to kind of wrap up this topic. He says, impermanence, the Dalai Lama reminds us, is the nature of life. All things are slipping away, and there's a real danger of wasting our precious human life. Gratitude helps us catalog, celebrate, and rejoice in each day and in each moment before they slip through the vanishing hourglass of experience. Impermanence is one of the fundamental teachings of the Buddha. It'd say that he even passed away to show that aspect of impermanence. He's an enlightened being. He doesn't need to pass away, but his passing away was to show everything changes, everything passes away. Remember that incredible saying or teaching from D.T. Suzuki, everything changes. Perhaps it was no surprise to Sonia Lubomirsky. I can never pronounce her name correctly. She's professor of psychology, UC Riverside, and she's an accomplished author as well. It says that she said that gratitude is a factor that seems to influence happiness, along with our ability to reframe negative events into positive ones. It's already something that many of you have touched on, right? Because gratitude will allow us to embrace both of those, right? Equally. We can see them as part of, again, the warp and woof of life and not reject one and only accept the other. But the final factor that she found that was, beneficial in this regard was our ability to be kind and generous toward others, which the Dalai Lama and the Archbishop saw as two separate but related pillars: compassion and generosity. These are the next two we'll be going into for the remainder of the weekend here. When we recognize all that we have been given, it is our natural response to want to care for and give to others. Because once more, that wonderful word, interdependence. We are not here alone. We are in a world of interdependence. And so we are called upon to have compassion for the other beings we share this world with in particular, as well as to be responsive to their needs. So let me go to the sheet, but then I'm going to come back to the slides in a moment. I didn't quite get these sheets all set up with, well, maybe I did there. We'll go to this first. Okay, so for gratitude, sit quietly for a few minutes each day or evening, recalling three things from your day for which you are grateful. They suggest having a gratitude journal. This comes from the Book of Joy. You don't necessarily need to have something to write it in, but it can be kind of nice. If every day you write down three things, you can choose more if you want to be grateful for more, but something that you can look back on then and maybe say, wow, I have an awful lot to be grateful for. After a year, you will have filled it up with over 1,000 different things that you're grateful for. So it can be quite a useful tool. It was one other thing that I remember from some of you saw the film, I'm sure, The Secret. It has some Buddhist leanings, but it's also not completely Buddhist. But there was one guy in there, I think he had a gratitude rock or something like a polished rock that he kept in his pocket. And of course, every time he put his hand in his pocket, he would go, "Oh yeah, I need to be grateful." sometimes we need reminders to be grateful. And so that can be another tool that you might use is just you might wear a necklace or something that has a rock on it. And yet every time you go to grab it, you think of being grateful. A lot of us have our little, wrist malas, these wrist rosaries that, you can use whatever it is as a device to help you to remember any of these teachings for that matter. But I think with gratitude, it's really useful to be able to be grateful throughout our day. And that's what the practice that's from Brother David is all about. To be more mindful, let me actually make this a little bit larger. To be more mindful of gratitude in your daily life, you can try using Brother David's stop, look, go practice. There's a sheet that I have for that as well that I'll put on the screen. The first step is stop, just like, he said this advice is the same that you got when you were a kid, when you were approaching a road that you had to cross, right? You're on your way to school. You stop, right? You don't just keep walking into the intersection. You stop, you look, and then you go. But the idea is look here. I don't want look to think of it's only visual because then we only appreciate things that are in our immediate surrounding that are appearing to us visually. It's rather an internal looking, so we pause, we stop, we be still, then we look, we're attentive to and grateful for what is happening in this moment. And then we act on the insight that comes from your own intuition and reflection at that moment. That maybe it's just going forward and continuing what you're doing, but with a sense of deeper joy and gratitude for what that moment has given you. Again, because Brother David's whole thing is gratefulness in every moment. Gratefulness in any time is a perfect way to use that moment. See it as a rich opportunity. Um, Again, notice the results of this practice in your heart. Here's the stop, look, go practice thing that I have that I got off the internet from somebody else. This isn't Brother David, but you can, see a little bit more that he or she, I can't remember who it was, Brandy Lust, a woman, founder of Learning Lab Consulting. Um, Again, there is even a whole book that is based on stop, look, go. So if you are really curious about this practice, you can, do that. Maybe we could do it right now. This is a wonderful moment, a present moment. Let's just stop. Just be still right now for just a moment. And again, you can use your eyes, but you can use your ears. You can use any of your senses. You can use your thoughts, but just look, be attentive to what is going on in this moment, and develop some sense of gratefulness, gratitude for this moment. And then we go forward into continuing this class with whatever it was that you carry forward from that moment. Again, very wonderful practice. And, don't do it in the middle of like you're driving on the road. And probably best to do it in a place where you're not going to be unsafe. But we can, maybe when we're driving in a stretch of freeway where there's not much going on, have a moment to stop, look, go. But I really like this practice. In the slides, I put it together with like a little graphic to go with it. Let's see. Oh, not really that much graphic. I got a wonderful picture of Brother David there, but I've got the light, right? We have the red light, we have the yellow light, that's the caution light, and then the green, that's the go. So again, these are just as a summary of what we just talked about. On to, whoops, did you want that back up there? Sure. Um, let's go on to compassion. For compassion, I found this interesting little cartoon that says empathy and compassion. As I mentioned yesterday, empathy and compassion are not identical, but they are very much related. Um, it's kind of interesting. This unhoused person is on the street asking for money and holding a mirror so that when the person's looking, they see themselves. Of course, that's the empathy side of it, right? Empathy is where we are able to identify and feel what the other person is feeling. It's a very integral part of compassion. If we cannot feel the suffering of another, our compassion is just more like pity. In fact, in Buddhism, we often talk about how there are two near enemies of compassion. I like to point these out because I think sometimes we might get confused about whether we're being compassionate or not. One of them is pity. By near enemy, by the way, we mean something that seems like it is it, but it's not it. The far enemy of compassion is cruelty, right? And we all have seen it in our world, and in perhaps even we exhibited it at times in our lives when we were cruel to beings, maybe animals, insects, or something. But when we see that type of cruelty, that's the antithesis of compassion. That's the far enemy. But these can feel like compassion, but they're not quite on the mark. Pity has a sense of superiority to it, right? Where it's like, oh, I'm looking down on you and throwing money your way or throwing something your way and not really identifying the sameness, the equality with the other person. The empathy is lacking. So we have to be careful if we start feeling like we're being compassionate, but it's actually moving into pity, and we're only inflating our own sense of superiority in relation to the person that we are taking pity upon. I know they sometimes use this word pity in even Buddhist texts, and I find it kind of interesting. It's compassion is not pity. The other thing that can be a very kind of near enemy, close enemy of compassion is usually called like overwhelm. I think Pema Chodron had another phrase for this, something anxiety. Like the idea is that when we start feeling our empathy moves into the realm of experiencing what the other person is experiencing, and we almost become overwhelmed. We almost feel like, oh my gosh, I can't deal with the suffering of the world. And so we go running off into our cave and put our head under the pillow or whatever. We do something that is escaping from that because it feels like it's too much. Now, again, I sometimes do a course, teach a course. I'm not sure I'm even qualified to teach the course anymore because I haven't done it for so long and I haven't kind of kept up with things. It's through what we call the Foundation for the Development of Compassion and Wisdom. It's our secular branch in the FPMT. They operate out of England. And they did this longer course that I was trained in with my friend Tenzin Choki. That's where we got back together again after many years and become very good friends after that. But the longer course ended up falling by the wayside. It was just too difficult to execute and have it, really work. But they took a few pieces of it. And this one course is called Building Balanced Empathy. And I'm just bringing it up because I think it is addressing some of this, where we need to be careful about how our empathy is sort of in the middle. It will be on one side or the other, but make sure that it doesn't get lopsided. When they talk about balance, they're balancing between two forms of empathy, if you will. One of them is what we call our affective empathy, which is the feeling with another, which is an important part of it, right? You have to feel what the other person's feeling. Otherwise, your compassion and empathy are going to be lacking because the other person is going to feel that, right? You're sitting here holding my hand, but you're not identifying with my suffering. You're not really with me in my suffering. Remember, the word compassion means to feel with, to suffer with. Okay. So that's the one that sometimes can become pity because we get a bit distant from it. We don't think that that's I'm sorry, I'm using affective. That's the one. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's the one that would become sorry, when you lack affective, then it could become kind of cold and distant. But whereas when you do have affective, then we can sometimes have an overload of that. And that can become the overwhelm, where we don't have this differentiation between this is the person and their problem, and this is me who doesn't have the problem but is trying to identify with the problem, be with the problem. So this idea of effective empathy is to be able to have a nice sort of boundary or border in terms of recognizing this is their suffering, this is me as the person who is there with them, but not going overboard, not identifying with it so much. Like if you were in really distress, maybe you came home and you found that your house had been robbed and you called a neighbor and friend and they came over to help you. And all they were doing was just like being stressed out and anxious, because they feel like it's almost them that it happened to. It wouldn't be of much help to you, right? Because you're already in a bit of distress and dealing with that. For the effective one, you really want somebody, again, to be able to set their own needs aside to some degree and be with you, but not set their needs aside so much that they aren't with you at all. Does that make sense? So the affective is important to have that kind of imbalance, but the other side of it we have to balance it with is cognitive empathy. Cognitive empathy can feel cold if that's all that's there. If the person that you call over comes in and all they do is they go, well, have you called the police yet? Well, have you done this? Well, have you checked to see whether you know all your valuables are there? Have you? I mean, they would be trying to fix the problem and doing it from a very sort of distant approach, but there's no effective empathy there. There's nothing that is really helping us to feel like the person's with us in our distress. So you have to have both. I mean, if you came into the situation and all you were was just identifying with the suffering, but not really offering to do anything that would help move the situation forward, then you're lacking the cognitive empathy. Anyway, these two of pity and overwhelm can be signs that your empathy is a bit out of balance, out of whack. You know, that you're starting to move back into a detached mode and looking at things more cognitively and not as effectively. And then, of course, if you get too much into the affective and not enough cognitive, then you might start feeling that sense of overwhelm being with somebody. But nonetheless, this is just something I'm pointing out because I found when I do this whole workshop on people working with this, that it's really quite enlightening because, yes, please, Carol, the microphone's on its way.
How do you work with when you see such horrific
Mm.
children, families?
Mhm.
Gaza is a good example.
Right.
I find myself, I want to be informed, but I cannot. The barrage of such suffering is
Mhm.
overwhelming. How does one deal with that?
Well, I think we have to be sensitive to where we're at with that and not push ourselves. You know, change generally comes gradually. And so, again, if we can expose ourselves to what we're comfortable with, and then if we need to pull back, recognize that we've fallen into that more, distressing, overwhelm kind of situation, and try to, again, think of it. I think it's hard with situations that we're not intimately involved with. When we see them, they're, on the other side of the world and we're looking at them from a distance and trying to be compassionate in response to it because there's nothing we can really do. I mean, the cognitive side of it comes into play when there's something we can do. There are things you can do. I'm not saying there's nothing you can do. I mean, you can make your donations to the Red Cross or, the World Kitchen, all these organizations that are doing things to on the ground, Doctors Without Borders, all these amazing organizations that are there putting their own lives at risk, to do that kind of work. And so that may be a response that you do is you to kind of take in as much as you can to keep the heart open to that suffering. But when you see the heart starts feeling like, okay, I've had enough, I can't really open up anymore, that maybe then we move to something that is more about, well, how do I address it? Even if you don't have the resources to give or are not necessarily inclined to do that, then sit in meditation and generate some thoughts of compassion and love for the beings who are experiencing all of this. That means you are going to have to be aware of their suffering as you're doing that. But that's the wonderful thing, where we'll talk about that as we go through compassion, is that there are ways to kind of exercise our heart to get our heart more resilient so that we can be open to more and more suffering. Yeah.
Thank you for that, because that's really the issues that you feel like you can't do anything.
Hmm.
And I think some of the options of, even if it is meditating on their suffering and trying to relieve that suffering, you feel that's a good way to respond to that, because you don't want to turn the other way, like it's not existing,
Sure.
but you also want to help to move the energy in a more
Mhm.
positive, uplifting,
Mhm.
you know, way. So that's the frustrations that you feel like you can't do
Sure.
anything.
Sure.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. I mean, and again, there are probably many, if there was, and some of you may be activists much more so than I am. I do what I can, but I'm sure there are many ways that we can support anti-war efforts that go beyond the things I've suggested even, or that are about, helping the people that are in Gaza, people in Ukraine or whatever is kind of moving us to have some compassionate response. But because I don't want to go to this place. I think when we talk about compassion, sometimes we think that, especially a Buddhist perspective of it, is that you're kind of, the work you need to do is just sitting on your cushion and doing that type of meditation, and that's enough. I think we need to be, again, these two, compassion and generosity, are together because some forms of generosity are taking an interest in doing what we can to alleviate the suffering of the world, being generous with our time, our resources, whatever it is that we can to benefit others. So I do hear this sometimes from people who are Buddhist practitioners. It's like, well, and even some of our lamas sometimes seem to emphasize, like, well, you really can't help beings until that you become enlightened. Well, no, you can help beings. I mean, I think they mean you can't help them ultimately, can't help them perfectly. That's the whole goal of becoming a Buddha, is that then with an omniscient mind, you know exactly what you need to do to help others. I don't have an omniscient mind. I sit here and I just go blah, 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 and hope that my words are a benefit to everyone who's in the room. But there's no guarantee that I'm saying what you need to hear or the words that you would like to hear or whatever. A Buddha has that ability. But while we are on this path moving towards Buddhahood or whatever spiritual goal each of us has, we should be doing everything we can to keep enlarging our compassion and our compassionate response to the suffering of the world. I mentioned this yesterday, Friday. I don't remember when I mentioned things sometimes. It's like it all becomes a blur. But Buddhism has a pretty far way to go to have that kind of on the ground, the boots on the ground, compassionate approach to things. We don't have a lot of agencies, and even our centers. We just had a regional meeting that took place here in North American region here at Land of Medicine Buddha. I wasn't here for it physically. I came in via Zoom. And it is kind of interesting that a lot of centers haven't really found a way to incorporate community service into what they do. And I'm not pointing fingers or saying, it's good to be aware of where we have something we need to work on. Buddhism hasn't done maybe quite as good a job at that, at least particularly our organization, and we can freely admit it and say that's something that we want to work on. Some organizations, I think Bhikkhu Bodhi, a wonderful Theravadan monk, he has a World Hunger Project that he does every year. I think it's pretty big in the Bay Area here. And even Venerable Dreame, the nun who used to be here, she's up taking care of her mother in Washington State now, but she used to do things, I think, with them. And it's like a huge walk they do every year to raise funds to defeat hunger in our world. I mean, wonderful things that have come out of some Buddhist organizations. And I think Thich Nhat Hanh is very much responsive, his organization. We have a ways to go. So I just want to point out that being compassionate, that work on the cushion is good, to say, I need to keep my heart open. I need to exercise that muscle of compassion that is so important to be able to respond to the world. But then I also have to respond. So I don't know, sorry, I'm getting preachy. Okay, let's go back to our slides. We haven't even really, we have another comment. I'm sorry. Erin, I didn't see your hand up. Yeah, please.
I hope this is helpful. Just trying to get my own thoughts together about this. But I had the opportunity to work with human trafficking survivors,
Oh, wow.
and I haven't had that experience.
Mhm.
But I think this thinking about what happens in the mind when someone else is trying to control you was something I was able to tap into to show compassion to the survivors, because I realized that we've all been under someone else's spell before.
Sure.
And so you kind of try to find, I was in that moment trying to find the commonality between us, whoever was sitting with me, and the story they were telling, because everyone's story is so different. So I don't know if that's helpful in terms of kind of finding how you can, because compassion kind of seems, it's hard to understand what that is exactly until you know what it is for you with that one person or a group of people. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I also heard it in the book too, under despair. And Desmond Tutu was talking about how one of their Democratic nominees was killed, shot, executed, and they were all really looking forward in South Africa to have this person change what had been happening. And he had his own experience of grief and despair, of like mourning this person that died. And then he had to speak like just a couple hours after. Wow. And to a whole community of people. And I thought, wow, that's very rare for a person to be in that position. And also it was inspiring to think that he got to a place in his heart and in his mind where he had his own despair and grief about
Right.
what had happened. So then when he spoke to a group of people, he could show up
Right.
and say that I totally feel you. I feel the same way.
Right.
So it's kind of like this, just
Mhm.
checking in on yourself and knowing what that would look like for you, and
Right.
then being able to show up in the best way you could for someone else.
Yeah.
I still haven't figured it out, of course, but I didn't know if that was a helpful example.
Oh, no, that's great. I think again that we do see that what you pointed out, that there's always something to identify with. We may not be able to feel, and that is a mistake. We might say, oh, I know what you're feeling. You don't know what the person's feeling, really. You don't know what it's like to be exactly in their shoes. But that's a wonderful capacity we have as human beings, is to have some things that we can identify with, that we can relate to from our own experience, and then we can be with the other person in their pain. So thank you. Yeah. Yes, Chris, please.
Can you give maybe just a little advice on when the layperson is on the cushion
Mhm.
thinking about things in the world? Is there something you can add to that practice to make it, or add to that meditation that makes it more of a practice? So that,
Mm,
I mean, I know I've read about when you get to the point where you can transform, you take responsibility for it, you this, you that, so that you're actually on some level changing your world or whatever. So,
yeah.
is there a sort of a base level way of doing that that isn't about,
Mm.
it's all my fault, but taking total responsibility? Or can you think of a way of making just being on the cushion, thinking about the things in the world,
Yeah.
kind of like the when you're in the bathroom and going,
Changing your,
all beings have pure water or whatever.
yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. I mean, again, there are a variety of practices. I don't want to spend too much time going in that direction, but the goal, of course, in Tibetan Buddhism is that compassion has kind of different levels to it. The first is where we just think about all those beings that we're holding in mind that are having these, again, everyone's suffering at some level, but if we're focusing on a particular group, like say the people of Gaza who have been, so much grief and loss and pain and suffering that has happened, then we bring to mind them and think of how wonderful it would be if they were relieved of that, if they didn't have to experience that. It's kind of a way of just reimagining the world. And the second level that they say is to think, may they be free of that, which is kind of like you're the ruler of a kingdom or queendom or whatever it is, and you are making the decree. You are saying, okay, it's going to be that. They're going to be free of suffering. May they be free from suffering. But this third thing you're kind of alluding to some degree in what you said, Chris, is to say, and I will become the cause of that. I will become a part of creating that. It's sort of a way of generating even just those thoughts are really strong intentions. You know, it's not that the whole world is going to be free of suffering merely by saying how wonderful it would be if that were the case. That's why we have to get to the third one eventually, where we just say, okay, and I'm going to take responsibility for that. Now, again, does it mean I'm going to be the instrument by which all suffering in the world is going to be relieved? Well, that's pretty messianic. That's pretty outrageous to think that I could do that. But I want to be that force in the world, in my actions throughout my day, as well as when I eventually become a Buddha and am dedicated to that fully with all the capacity to do that. So I would encourage working with those three steps when we're bringing to mind the suffering of others. They have a fourth one that you can add if you have some conviction in Buddhas or Jesus Christ or whoever it is that you see as a special power in the world that can help you. The fourth one is to think, bless me to be able to do this, because we're not in this alone. I think, again, Christians would say the same thing. Jewish people would say, everyone who has some belief in a higher power says that you're not in this alone. You have something you can rely upon that's bigger than you, that's more developed than you, or whatever, that can influence you in a positive way. So, again, how wonderful it would be if that was so. May that be so. I myself will cause that to be so. I will become an agent of that. And please bless me to be able to do that. So those are the steps I always talk about in terms of generating compassion, at least the first three. But once more, if you have some conviction that there's something out there, a force in the world that can help you. Now, there's even other more longer practices, such as the practice of four-arm Chenrezig or thousand-arm Chenrezig or whatever, all these, this Buddha of compassion, and you can visualize that Buddha appearing on your crown or in your heart and sending out rays of light that go out and relieve the suffering of all beings. And then, every being becomes enlightened or whatever. Buddhist practices are very rich when it comes to some of those things. So feel free to add on those sorts of things as well that are very dynamic practices that many people find useful because you get into visualization. Visualization is a very creative way to work with our minds. So there's a lot of answers to your question, Chris, but I hope that gives you some things to work with. Let's get back into empathy and compassion. Again, we're going to go till about 10:15 or so, so I can get through most of this. But again, we'll make it through the material. Trust me. I have a way of being able to do that somehow. I don't know how it happens, but too much self-centered thinking is the source of suffering. A compassionate concern for others' well-being is a source of happiness. Dalai Lama had said this earlier in the week that they were spending there. And so Douglas Abrams says he was now rubbing his hands together in thought as we returned to the topic of compassion. So again, the self-centered thinking, me, myself, and I, is the source of so much of our suffering. Because when we think we're in our little silo, we neglect and are oblivious to the suffering of others. We're concerned for others, and again, that's defeated. And we become happy, we have joy. On this planet, over the last 3,000 years, different religious traditions developed. All these traditions carry the same message, the message of love. So the purpose of all these different traditions is to promote and strengthen the value of love, compassion. So different medicine, but same aim. All of these different religious traditions exist with the same aim. To cure our pain, our illness. As we mentioned, even scientists now say that our basic human nature is compassionate. I don't know if that's scientists across the board, but I think they are finding that kind of at the core of our being is, again, what Chogyam Trungpa called our soft spot, that sort of ability that we have to connect with others and to be open to their suffering, their happiness, to be able to have an empathy with all beings. And as mammals in particular, they've often seen that compassion in animals is taught with the bond between the mother and their offspring. And that's kind of the seed of the compassion that manifests when they become parents of their offspring and so on. And of course, we see that in human culture as well. The degree to which we receive love and compassion from those around us often influences our own ability to manifest that. But it seems that there is a common core that is this essence of empathy and compassion. This is a wonderful book, A Fearless Heart, that Thupten Jinpa wrote. He's written a couple of books. Again, he's His Holiness's translator. And he says in there, compassion, how he defines it, is it's a sense of concern that arises when we are confronted with another suffering and feel motivated to see that suffering relieved. Now, what I would point out here is don't think that it is only seeing another's suffering. It can be seeing your own suffering. We're going to talk about that as part of this section on compassion, is that self-compassion is a practice that has been adopted pretty widely now in a lot of psychology and people working with those who have, again, issues where they don't care for themselves enough. They are not tending to their own suffering and needs. And so it's useful for all of us, though, because to some degree we tend to bypass our own, need for our own addressing our own suffering. And so we're going to talk about that in a bit. He adds, compassion is what connects the feeling of empathy to acts of kindness, generosity, and other expressions of altruistic tendencies. So again, empathy is kind of the root, the ability to feel what the other person is feeling. And I know that they do say in Western psychology that some people lack empathy, that they're not as empathic as others. And some people say some people are very, very empathic, where they cannot almost be with other people who are suffering because they feel too much. It's, again, a bit of a overwhelm. But I would put forward that empathy is also, again, something that can be developed and can be regulated to some degree so we can be with others from that place. Compassion comes from that empathy when we see the suffering of others, and then we engage in acts of kindness, generosity, and so on the basis of that. try to address and deal with the suffering of the world. And it is amazing when you look at how much of our world is about helping to relieve the suffering of others. All the agencies and people who are dedicated to that, a good share of working professions are in the helping profession, giving aid to others who are suffering, medical professions, what have you. Really, again, a lot of societies about helping others to have what they have, but those are maybe more specific in terms of helping professions. These are the topics that are talked about, and I'm going to go through them a little quickly, especially the benefits of compassion. I've got a number of slides for them. I think I'll just go through them in summary and go through them one by one. The essential advice for cultivating compassion is what we're going to start with. While we all carry what the Dalai Lama calls the seed of compassion, again, that being our nature, from our own experience of being nurtured by others, as I mentioned, that's often how we receive that compassion initially, and the seeds of compassion are planted within us. Compassion is actually a skill that can be cultivated. Something we can actually develop within our own minds through meditation, kind of integrated through our daily life, living from a place of compassion and so on. It is something that we can learn to develop and then use to extend our circle of concern beyond our immediate family to others. It helps when one recognizes our shared humanity. Again, when we talk about how we all have compassion, I guess what's being pointed out here and what we have to be cognizant of is that we tend to have compassion only for a limited number of beings. That is, again, quite natural and understandable. It is harder to have compassion for like the whole world eventually and all the beings that exist, because that's really pretty outrageous. It's not something we're taught from a very young age. We tend to have compassion for those beings who are kind of complementary to us. I'm going to point out here that in Buddhism, we often talk about 3 different groups of beings on the basis of the relationship that they have to us. And it's a natural way to identify them. But don't think that there's anything kind of inherent about that, because they're not fixed in regard to that. There are what we call our friends, acquaintances, the people who are very close to us. That's the bubble where our compassion generally extends to quite easily. You get a call from a friend and they say, "Oh my gosh, my car just broke down. Would you mind coming over and picking me up? I need to get to the da da da." You're like, "Yeah, absolutely. I'll drop everything and get over there," right? Because we care about their suffering, because they're a friend. The next group are the strangers. We call them, Pema Chodron calls them neutrals. They're neutrals because like we don't have any relationship with them. So usually our compassion's a bit challenged there, though it is occasionally we do get compassion for those beings. Like when you see the shots on the news or something of people in Gaza, young children in particular tend to move people really strongly, right? When we see young children who have their lives have been just decimated, lost their parents, lost their house, and maybe lost many of their relatives, and they're just abandoned. Then you go online and you go to the Red Cross or whatever, and you make sure that you send a donation and you do whatever. Sometimes we do have compassion in that way, or we sit on the cushion and we meditate about their compassion and really want them to be free of that suffering. But in general, we're pretty indifferent to what goes on to strangers, right? Any of you who didn't know each other coming to this weekend, you were a stranger before, right? Might have walked by each other on the street somewhere and had no regard for each other's welfare. That's understandable, right? Because it is hard to be intimately involved with the welfare of all beings. But nonetheless, when we see strangers, we do see that is our default mode, is that we just get kind of indifferent. Then we have the third group. The third group are the toughies, the challenging people. We call them enemies, but it's not like Batman and the Penguin or something, where it's like you've got this enemy that is your arch enemy and you need to defeat him or whatever. Often it's just the people who annoy us or who bother us, whose political views are different than us or whatever. It's the othering that we tend to do in the world, and we think that those people are opposed to us in some way. And of course, what's our natural response to them? It's not compassion at all. It's an anger or frustration or whatever, something that we're generating. And it might even be that Schadenfreude, right? Where we take delight when they suffer, when we hear, oh, they've had a heart attack or this has happened to them or they deserved it, good for them. They now are seeing the fruits of their actions or whatever. So again, these are the three attitudes that we have to be mindful of that are somewhat obstacles to our having compassion to all these beings. Why, there's not an obstacle in regard to the friends unless we become attached to our friends. I haven't talked about that really, but attachment in Buddhism is a big thing to work on. Attachment to our friends means that we're not just seeing them as suffering beings. We are involved in a relationship with them that is very much about tit for tat. You do for me, and then I do for you. It's like if we get that call from that friend and they say, "Oh, please come, my car's broken down," and we go and do that, and then our car breaks down and we call them and they go, "Ah, what are you calling me for? I'm busy today. I can't help you." Then we'd be like, "What? You're not helping me?" Right? Because we're attached to that person. We have made it conditional. So we do have a conditionality with our friends. We do have this indifference towards strangers. We do have the resistance towards the enemies, the difficult people. But we need to open up to compassion to all of them. So we need to see that those attitudes require some adjustment, require some standing back, so that we don't have compassion just for these people who are in our circle of friends, which may still be somewhat conditional. We can enlarge it to include the strangers. We can even enlarge it to include our enemies. Remember that was talked about earlier by His Holiness. We looked at that yesterday, that he had compassion for the Chinese officer who was beating the young Tibetan boy with this iron rod, right? Because he sees that person as a suffering being. Can we see the suffering of an enemy in the same way that we see the suffering of our friends? Anyway, that's just a little aside on the tendency that we have to divide people into those groups, and therefore our compassion can be very biased. All right. As we have discussed, the Dalai Lama began, we're social animals. Even for kings or queens or spiritual leaders, their survival depends on the rest of the community. So therefore, if you want a happy life and fewer problems, you have to develop a serious concern for the well-being of others. People who tend to be quite self-centered and selfish, again, karmically, it's not always evident because some people who are in positions where they have benefited so much from the welfare of others are really quite selfish still. But nonetheless, this is how it should ideally work, is that we should be attentive to the fact that we depend upon others for so many aspects of our well-being. This is a quote from His Holiness that is often brought to mind, especially this phrase that I've underlined, wisely selfish. His Holiness, this isn't from the Book of Joy, but he says, my advice is that if you must be selfish, if you're going to be self-concerned, be wisely selfish. Wise people serve others sincerely, putting the needs of others above their own. Ultimately, you will be happier. That's kind of the trick of it, is that we become happier and have greater satisfaction when we are attentive to the needs of others. The kind of selfishness that provokes fighting, killing, stealing, using harsh words, forgetting other people's welfare, will only result in your own loss. This is getting at the fundamental basis for these mind training teachings that I've alluded to so often this weekend, is that we are trying to diminish and lessen our self-centeredness, because we see that it's the source of all of our problems. When we're self-centered, we don't care who we step on and who gets injured in the process of us getting what we want. It's a lose-lose situation. Others are injured and hurt by our actions, and we don't really get the happiness we seek. Karmically, especially, we are creating only more negative patterns of being focused on me, myself, and I and what I want. You may think you're getting what you want in the moment by stepping all over other people and getting that promotion, by putting everyone else down that's up for the promotion, but you're actually not going to get the happiness that you seek in the long term. Whereas if you are focused on the needs of others, your actions are going to be more virtuous and wholesome. You're going to be involved in doing things for them, being generous towards them, being kind towards them. You will create positive energy that will carry over into future experiences of happiness, and probably even be happier in the moment. And you are generating happiness for the other person by doing things for them. It's a win-win situation. In the mind training teachings, they call this replacing the self-cherishing mind, self-centered mind, with the cherishing others mind, the mind that cherishes other beings. We have this exchange of self and others that we're doing, where we think the same way that I hold myself right now to be most important, I want to hold other beings to be most important. It's based on the idea of compassion and love for beings, being able to see that again, they're just like us, but moreover, logically, as His Holiness was pointing out with that statement, that's the wisest way to be selfish. If you really are caring about your own well-being, well, care for others. You know? Rinpoche would often say that, if you want to cherish, take care of yourself, then take care of others. The real sun of happiness shines, Rinpoche would say, when you begin to cherish others. Yes, please, Elena. Yeah, let's get the microphone for you.
Can a narcissist develop empathy, authentic empathy and compassion?
I'm not a professional on a narcissist and working with it. I always want to believe that anyone can change. And of course, Buddhism is based on the idea that our minds are capable of change. Is it harder for a narcissist to change than someone who doesn't have that and kind of tendency, diagnosed way of kind of going about living their lives? Probably, because a narcissist is going to become so self-focused that they end up using others in such a horrible way that it's very hard for them to begin to identify with the suffering they've caused to others. They can only see it from their own point of view. But is that impossible? I have a hard time saying that they can't do it, but I don't know enough about the clinical side of it and dealing with our, and I also do tend to think, though, that, of course, in Western psychology, you don't have the same dimensions to things that you do in Buddhism. Buddhism, if you went to your therapist, or some professional who's working with mental health, and you said, I want to be free of all of my anger, all of my jealousy, all of my greed, and only be happy, compassionate, loving, kind every moment of the day, they would say, I can help you maybe deal with a little bit of that. But they even probably have a perspective that having a little bit of anger, a little bit of jealousy, that these are okay. It's, again, the pathology happens when it becomes obsessive and when things go out of a range. Narcissism is a pathology. It's something that is outside of the range of general self-concern. And so even when you get to going to a therapist and saying, I want to get rid of my self-centeredness, they say, well, you have to care for yourself. What are you talking about? But but you do have to see the right way to care for yourself. And in Buddhism, this is only through caring for others, really, that we have our ultimate self-care, self-concern. So again, all of these things, I think, go outside of what we label in Western psychology as various pathologies, and recognize that every being that has a mind, especially a human being who has the ability to work with that mind in this life, has the potential to change that mind. Because there's no inherent narcissist. Narcissists are products of what they've done in the past that have led them to that type of behavior. Again, that's my point of view as a Buddhist teacher, but again, have a Western psychiatrist or whatever come in and say very different things about what their belief is about narcissism. But I think it's much harder, sure, very difficult for someone who's in that mode of being to begin to open to the welfare of others when they have been so blindly going about ignoring it and only being attentive to their own needs, which is what a narcissist, as I
Thank you.
understand it, tends to do. Yeah, Joy, please.
Lena was asking for a friend, right?
Hey,
Yes, Joy.
it's a little related. I've been thinking a lot about this weekend, and so I'm taking this as a segue. The other side, which could be codependency, when
Mhm,
we care so much about someone that we lose ourselves.
mhm,
I just got out of a relationship where that happened, and so
mhm,
and I'm aware that's like, again, like a condition, as you say, and
mhm.
Buddhism doesn't talk about that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm curious to hear. And I think you talked about like overwhelm. I can, I did really see myself in that, being overwhelmed by someone else, suffering, and then sort of like shutting
Yeah.
down because of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm curious if you have thoughts about that.
Yeah, no, thank you for bringing that up, Joy, because I think it goes back to these two kind of sides of it. And that was even like when we talk about empathy, that there are sort of two sides. We have to have the affective side of it that's with them, with compassion, with a feeling for them and what they're going through. And you also have to have a cognitive component, a wisdom component. That's not that far off of this wisdom and compassion, these two main principles that are used in Mahayana Buddhism as something that are meant to be brought together, not fall on one side or the other. I think, don't take this phrase wrong, but Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche used to call kind of this overwhelm or this going too far on the side of compassion. He used to call it idiot compassion, where you just go about doing things, but you don't think about what you're doing. You need a cognitive aspect, a wisdom aspect to work with people who are abusers, who are, dealing with substance issues or whatever, so that you don't become codependent, so that you don't do what is for them actually most harmful rather than doing what is more helpful. So it's easy to fall into that. Absolutely. Codependency is very common because we feel for the person, and especially because it's someone very close to us, dear to us, in a relationship with us. We feel like this is how we show our love, is by attending to their problem in a way that is not healthy. So really it boils back down to those two aspects needing to be there. And then we go to the resources that can help us to break patterns of codependency, and we find out, what is the most helpful thing to do when somebody is being this way, and I have compassion for them, but I have to understand the right thing isn't to give in to them and to facilitate their craziness. It's to actually find a different approach. So it all boils down to those same two things. Again, there are professionals out there who can help, who have worked with this much more than I have as a Buddhist teacher, that can give advice about how to break patterns of codependency with a person who, and separating from it is one possibility, but also we might be able to help them in other ways by staying engaged, but having a different way of working with it because we're wiser. We've looked into it and understand when we're going to fall into the trap of codependency. So, sorry you have been through that. I'm sure it's very painful and difficult. But there is, a way to work with it. It's not just a dead end where you can't ever get out of it. And certainly it's not something that is easy to work with, but there's that possibility. We're just past 10:15. Let me go back to the slides just to see if there was anything more on this topic, which is again, the essential advice. And if there isn't, then we will take our little break. Nope, there isn't. When we come back, we'll look at the benefits of compassion. There's a number of them. As I said, I'll just kind of go through them in a more cursory way. We'll get through compassion and go on to our final pillar. All right. So going to take again about 45 minutes. We'll meet at 11 o'clock. If folks could be back here right then, and I will be here, I promise, to get things started again. And we'll go from there. All right, during the break, just again, we've had a lot of teachings already, even today, that you can think about some of the gratitude practices or compassion. As you look at other people here, other people in the room that might be on break with you, as other people, there are many people that wander the grounds on the weekend and are here to take in Land of Medicine Buddha. Just try to look at them through that lens. Of compassion, care, concern. You don't have to get up there and talk to them and find out what's going on for them and try to solve their problems. That's not what I'm saying. Just have that lens of compassion. Thich Nhat Hanh calls this seeing through the eyes of compassion. It's a kind of a nice way to go about our day, where everyone we see as an object of compassion. All right, enough of me going blah, blah, blah. Enjoy your break.